The year was 1877, and the high country had not yet been broken to the saddle. It was a place of hard edges and thin mercy. Down from the foothills, where the prairie grass gave way to scree, sat a trading post that was more mud than timber. It was a place men came to trade hides for bullets, lies for whiskey, and sometimes souls for coin. Today, Silas Croft, a man whose morality was as thin as his hair, was running a work auction. It was a cruel business, born of desperation. The railroads brought families west, and the West chewed them up. Husbands died in mines, or disappeared on hunts, or were simply broken by the unforgiving land. They left behind widows and daughters with no means and no protection. These women, and others who had simply fallen through the cracks of a lawless world, ended up here. Silas called it an auction of employment contracts, a 5-year indenture for domestic service, or mending, or work in one of the saloons up in the mining camps. The men who gathered knew exactly what it was. They stood in the dusty, wind-swept yard, a rough collection of prospectors, ranchers with lonely spreads, and hard-eyed saloon keepers. They spat tobacco juice into the dirt and judged the merchandise. 4 women had already been sold. One, a stout woman with a face like baked bread, went to a rancher for $40. Another, younger, who cried silently, was bought by a man in a bowler hat who ran a boarding house in Pueblo. The last one was shoved forward. She was not a woman. She was a sketch of one, a collection of sharp angles held together by dirty skin. Her hair, the color of wet straw, was matted and hung in her face. Her dress was a rag of gray homespun, and she had no shoes. Her bare feet were caked in the yard's cold mud. "Now this one," Silas began, his voice straining for a salesman's cheer. "This one's a quiet sort. Good for mending, perhaps, not much for heavy field work, but she's available." The crowd snickered. A man shouted, "She available for a burial plot, Silas?" "Looks like she already dug her own," another added, and the laughter grew. The young woman did not seem to hear them. Her eyes were dull, fixed on a point somewhere beyond the jeering faces. She swayed on her feet, a reed in the rising wind. "What's the bid?" Silas pushed. $5. A $5 contract for 5 years of work. Can't beat that." No one moved. Even these men had their limits. She was too close to death. She was a bad investment. $3? Silas tried, his voice turning sour. "Come now. She just needs a few square meals. She's got—" He reached out to turn her, to show her off, but his hand never landed. As his fingers grazed her arm, the young woman's body gave up. There was no dramatic fall. She simply folded. Her knees buckled. Her spine curved, and she collapsed into the mud at his feet, limp as a pile of wet laundry. She landed with a soft, wet sound, and lay still. The crowd went silent for a beat, and then the mockery returned, harsher this time. A prospector in greasy buckskins nudged her hip with the toe of his boot. "Aye, she's a worker, good at sleeping in the dirt." "Leave her," a voice rumbled. "The buzzards'll have her by nightfall." "Hold on," Silas snapped, embarrassed and angry. He kicked at her shoulder, trying to rouse her. "Get up, girl! Get up, damn you!" She did not move. Then a shadow fell over them. He had been standing at the edge of the clearing, back by the pines, next to a broad-chested roan horse. He had not been part of the auction. He had just been watching. Now, he moved. He was a massive man, built on the scale of the mountains he came from. A wild, tangled beard, more brown than black, covered his face to his cheekbones. His hair was a shaggy mane under a worn felt hat. He wore hides, mostly wolf and deer, stitched together with rough sinew. He looked less like a man and more like a piece of the wilderness that had decided to walk. The crowd parted for him without a word. The men who had been laughing and spitting fell silent, their eyes dropping. They knew him, or rather, they knew of him. The mountain man ignored them all. He walked past Silas and knelt in the mud beside the collapsed woman. For a moment, He just looked at her, his expression hidden by the shadow of his hat and the tangle of his beard. The prospector who had kicked her took a long, slow step backward. Then, the mountain man did something that stunned the yard into absolute silence. He moved gently. His hands, which were scarred and calloused and looked large enough to palm a boulder, slid under the woman's skeletal frame. One hand cupped her shoulders. The other went under her knees. He lifted her as if she weighed no more than the hides on his back. Her head lolled, and her muddy, bare feet dangled. He stood to his full, imposing height, holding the frail woman against his chest. Silas Croft finally found his voice, a mixture of confusion and indignation. "Here now, Kane, you can't just— the auction ain't finished for this one." The mountain man, Josiah Kane, turned his head. His eyes, dark and flat as river stones, settled on the auctioneer. When he spoke, his voice was a low growl, like rocks grinding together. "This one's not for sale." He started walking toward his horse. But my fee," Silas stammered, his greed warring with his fear. "There's a contract fee. You can't just take her." Kane stopped. Without looking back, he reached into a pouch at his belt. He pulled out a heavy coin, a $20 gold piece, and tossed it over his shoulder. It landed in the mud near Silas's boot. "For your trouble," Kane said. He did not wait for a reply. He did not wait for permission. He walked the remaining distance to his horse, the crowd shrinking away from his path. They knew the stories. This was the man who lived alone up on Spanish Peaks, the ex-hunter, some said, though what he'd hunted was a mystery. They said he'd come from Missouri after the war, a fugitive. They said he had shot 2 lawmen dead, a U.S. Marshal and his deputy, who had tried to bring him in near the Arkansas River. Whether it was murder or self-defense, no one knew, and no one was foolish enough to ask. For 3 years, Josiah Kane had been a ghost, seen only at a distance, or here at the post twice a year for salt, lead, and coffee. He spoke to no one, and no one spoke to him. Today, no one challenged him. He reached his horse, a powerful roan gelding with a mean eye, with one arm still holding the woman. He swung himself up into the saddle. He settled her in front of him, cradled against his chest, and wrapped a piece of his oilcloth coat around her thin body. She was a still, cold weight. He pulled the horse's head around and kicked its flanks, turning it from the trading post and toward the high, dark mountains to the west. A storm, which had been gathering all morning, was rolling in behind them. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, and the wind carried the first sharp bite of sleet. The men in the yard watched until the massive man and his broken burden were swallowed by the pines and the approaching weather. Then, as one, they let out the breath they had been holding. The journey was a slow torment. The trail was not a trail, but a track that only Kane and the animals knew. It climbed steeply, winding through spruce and rock slides. The storm broke over them with a cold, driving rain that quickly turned to wet, heavy snow. The woman remained unconscious for the first hour, a dead weight against his chest. Then, as the cold seeped in, she began to shiver. The shivers turned into violent, racking shakes. Kane stopped the horse in the lee of a granite overhang. He pulled a wool blanket from his saddle roll and managed to wrap it tighter around her, shielding her with his own body as much as he could. She was burning with fever. Her skin, where it touched his, was dry and hot. She began to mutter. Her voice was a cracked whisper, incoherent and desperate. "No, no. Please, not the water. It's too cold. Just stop," he grunted, urging the horse onward. He was not a gentle man. He was not a kind man. He was a man who lived by a hard, simple code, and what he had seen in the yard had offended it. This was not charity. It was an impulse, and one he was already beginning to regret. The girl was dying. He was probably just dragging out the inevitable. She choked. He felt her body convulse and quickly pulled the horse up, turning her to the side just as she retched. Nothing came up but thin, sour bile. It splattered on the snow. She coughed, a dry, tearing sound, and then went limp again, her breath coming in shallow. Ragged gasps. He cursed under his breath, wiped his sleeve, and kept going. It was full dark by the time they reached the cabin. It was not a home. It was a shelter, a fortress, tucked into a high, snowy gulch where the creek was already freezing at the edges. The cabin was built of thick, dark logs, chinked tight against the wind. The snow was already a foot deep around it, and the only sign of life was the thin ribbon of smoke that curled from the stone chimney and was immediately torn apart by the wind. He dismounted, his legs stiff with cold. He carefully lowered the woman from the saddle and carried her inside, kicking the heavy door shut against the storm. The single room was dark, lit only by the orange glow of the embers in the massive stone fireplace. It smelled of pine smoke, cured hides, and old coffee. A cot was built into one wall, a rough table and 2 stools in the center. Rifles rested on pegs by the door. He laid her on the cot and piled dry blankets on top of her. She was shivering again, her teeth chattering. He moved with practiced efficiency, stoking the fire until it roared, adding wood until the small room began to fill with a dry, oppressive heat. He kept a pot of venison broth simmering on the hob. He ladled some into a tin mug, letting it cool just enough. He walked to the cot and knelt. "Girl," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. "You need a drink." He slid his arm under her head to lift her. The moment his hand touched her neck, her eyes flew open. They were not dull now. They were wide, blazing with a sudden, primal terror. She did not scream. She jerked. It was a violent, convulsive movement, throwing herself backward, away from his hand, away from the mug. She scrambled on the cot until her back hit the cold log wall, pulling the blankets up to her chin. She stared at him, her chest heaving, a raw gasp trapped in her throat. Josiah Kane froze. He had seen fear. He had seen it in men before a fight, in animals, in a trap. This was different. This was a fear so deep it was bone deep, a fear of any touch, even one meant to help. He held his position for a long moment, the mug steaming in his hand. Then, slowly, he lowered his arm. "It's broth," he said, his voice flat. "Nothing else." He placed the tin mug on the floor, a few feet from the cot, where she could reach it, but he was not. He stood up and walked away, turning his back to her. He went to the fire and pretended to tend to it, giving her the dignity of his disregard. He heard no movement. After a minute, he looked. She hadn't moved. She was still pressed against the wall, a cornered animal, her eyes fixed on him. "Drink it," he ordered, not unkindly, but with a hard finality. "Or you'll die. Makes no difference to me, but it's a waste of a walk." He busied himself checking the door's latch, moving his saddlebags. He did not look at her again. He heard a tiny scraping sound, the clink of tin on the wood floor. When he glanced back, the mug was gone. He heard a soft, desperate swallowing. He slept in his chair by the door, his rifle across his knees. The storm trapped them. For 3 days, the wind howled and the snow piled up against the door, sealing the small cabin in a world of white and gray. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness. The fever held her tight. When she was lucid, she was silent. When she slept, she cried out, muttering the same broken words. Not the water, cold. Kane tended to her with a brusque, impersonal efficiency. He forced more broth down her, and later, some thin oatmeal. On the second day, he knew he had to clean her. The dress she had collapsed in was stiff with mud, filth, and sweat. It was poisoning her. He boiled water and took a clean rag. "I'm taking that dress off," he stated. "You can fight me and lose, or you can let it be." She was too weak to fight. She just watched him, her eyes wide, as he took his knife and slit the rotten fabric up the back. He peeled it off her. He had expected her to be thin. He had not expected the landscape of her body. She was a map of old and new cruelties. Her ribs were stark under skin that was pale and translucent. Old bruises, yellow and purple, mottled her arms and legs. But it was the new marks that made his hand stop. A fresh whip scar, raw and red, cut diagonally across her back, from her left shoulder to her right hip. It was scabbed, but angry. It was not a casual mark. It was the work of a man who meant to leave a permanent brand. He said nothing. He dipped the rag in the hot water and began to wash the grime from her, his touch methodical. She shivered, her breath catching, but she did not flinch away this time. She just endured. He worked his way down, cleaning her legs, her feet, and then he found the other wound. It was on her left hip, just below the bone. It was not a whip mark. It was a stitched wound, maybe 3 inches long. The stitches were black thread, thick and clumsy, and the skin around them was red, swollen, and weeping. Infection had set in. Kane stared at it. This was different. This was not the passive cruelty of a whip. This was the result of a fight, or an escape. Someone had done this to her, or she had done it to herself, falling, and someone had stitched it up with the same care they'd use on a grain sack. The sight, the smell of the infection, hit him somewhere deep and old. Suddenly, he was not in his cabin in the Rockies. He was back in Missouri, in a makeshift field hospital after a skirmish. The air was thick with the smell of gangrene and cheap whiskey. He could hear the wet grating sound of the surgeon's saw. He could hear a boy, no older than 16, begging them not to take his leg. He closed his eyes for a second, his jaw tightening until the muscle jumped. He shook the memory away. "This is poisoned," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. She made a small, frightened sound. He went to his own stores. He pulled out a small tin of carbolic salve and a whetstone. He sharpened his skinning knife until the edge was razor sharp. He came back to the cot. "This will hurt," he said. It was the only warning he gave. He cut the black threads, one by one. She cried out, a thin, breathy sound, and arched her back, her fingers digging into the blanket. "Hold still," he commanded. He pressed the edges of the wound, forcing the infection out. He ignored her sharp intake of breath. He was not a doctor. He was a hunter, and he knew how to clean a wound, whether on a man or a beast. It was the same principle. Cut away the rot. He washed it with boiled water and carbolic soap until it was bleeding clean. He packed it with the salve and then bound her hip and waist with a long strip of clean linen. She was pale as the snow outside, her forehead slick with sweat, her body shaking. But the fever, the one that had been burning her, already seemed to be receding, replaced by the simple, clean pain of the wound. He finished and stepped back. He had an old, worn flannel shirt, one of his own. It was ridiculously large for her, but it was clean and warm. He lifted her and guided her arms through the sleeves, pulling it down to her knees. He expected her to fall back into delirium. He expected her to weep. She did neither. She lay back, breathing hard, her small hands clutching the wool blanket, and she watched him. Her eyes were no longer dull, and not just wide with terror. They were sharp. He felt her gaze follow him as he moved, as he cleaned his knife, as he put away the tin. She was weighing him. She was measuring his every move. It was the look of a trapped wolf, helpless but not defeated, calculating. She was haunted by whatever hell she had come from. She was suspicious of this new one, but underneath it all, he saw a bright, cold spark of intelligence. Josiah Kane was a man comfortable with silence, but this silence was different. It was heavy. It was the silence of two animals in a den, one wounded, the other waiting. He grunted, satisfied with his work. He turned his back to her and went to chop more kindling inside, the storm hissing against the chimney. "Rest," he said. The storm settled in. "We ain't going nowhere." She said nothing, but when he glanced over his shoulder, her eyes were still open, still fixed on him. The world shrank to the size of the cabin. The storm did not break. It settled in, a white siege that lasted 1 week, then 2. The wind was a constant, high-pitched scream that probed the log walls. The snow piled up, burying the single window in a deep, blue-white drift, and plunging the room into a perpetual twilight, lit only by the fire and a single oil lamp. Josiah Kane moved through the gloom with a restless energy. He would spend an hour every morning just clearing the snow from the door, a battle he fought with a wide shovel. He would vanish into the whiteout for hours, checking his trap lines, and return coated in ice, a brace of frozen, stiff rabbits hanging from his belt. The rest of the time, he was in the cabin, a massive, pacing presence. The space, which had been a fortress for one man, felt like a cage for two. Supplies grew tight. The coffee ran out first, a loss Kane felt with a simmering anger. The sack of flour was less than a quarter full. The salt was a handful of white crystals at the bottom of a wooden box. The venison he had cured was dwindling. They lived on rabbit stew, boiled rabbit, and thin, flat cakes made of flour and water, fried in rabbit fat. It was a bleak, gray existence, measured in logs added to the fire and the rising howl of the wind. The young woman recovered. The life in her, which had been a guttering ember, slowly brightened. It was the food, the relentless heat of the fire, and the rest. The broth and meat put a thin layer of flesh back on her bones. The color crept back into her face, turning her skin from a waxy, bluish white to a pale, milky cream. Her hair, washed with lye soap and water from the snowmelt bucket, was a startling shade of pale corn silk. He had cleaned and rebandaged her hip every day. The infection was gone. The wound, which he had brutally but effectively cleansed, was closing, drawing together in a puckered red line. She still wore his flannel shirt, which on her looked like a canvas tent. He had found a pair of his own winter moccasins, stuffed the toes with rabbit fur, and given them to her. She ate with a slow, deliberate hunger, as if still convincing herself the food was real, and she watched him. In the first week, her silence was absolute. She lived on the cot, a small, still figure in the shadows. Her eyes, a clear, sharp gray, followed his every movement. She watched him clear the snow. She watched him skin the rabbits, his huge, bloodied hands working with a speed and precision that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. She watched him check the loads in his rifles. She watched him mend a tear in his snowshoes with a strip of raw sinew. She said nothing, not one word. He, in turn, largely ignored her. He gave her food. He tended the fire. He cleaned her wound. He offered no conversation. He asked no questions. He was a man who lived his life in a hard, solitary rhythm, and he would not break it for her. The change began in the second week. It was small. He came back from his traps, shaking snow from his coat. He was tired, the cold deep in his bones. He dropped 2 rabbits on the floor and went to the fire, turning his back to her, holding his stiff hands to the blaze. She moved. He heard the rustle of the blankets. She slid off the cot. Her bare feet, she had taken off the moccasins, making no sound on the wood floor. She went to the water bucket, dipped the tin mug, and brought it to him. She did not touch him. She just stood near him, holding the mug out. Josiah looked at it. He looked at her. Her eyes were lowered. It was an offering. He took the mug and drank the cold water in one pull. "Get your feet off the floor," he growled. "You'll catch your death." He handed the mug back. She took it and scurried back to the cot, pulling the blankets over her legs. But a line had been crossed. The next day, while he was mending a strap on his powder horn, she got up and put a log on the fire. She did it awkwardly, almost dropping it, but she did it. He grunted. "Good." She began to move about the cabin more, her movements as quiet as a moth's. She would wipe the table. She would add wood. When he brought in the rabbits, she found his skinning knife and held it out to him, handle first. She was still terrified of him, of his size, of his sudden movements. But she was trying to be useful. She was trying to earn the broth and the fire. The true break came on a night when the storm was at its worst. The wind sounded like a living thing, a hungry animal clawing at the chimney. Kane was asleep in his chair, his rifle in his lap. The cabin was dark. The fire burned down to a deep, pulsing red. A sound tore the small room apart. It was not a word. It was a scream, a raw, high-pitched animal sound of pure, undiluted terror. Kane was on his feet before he was awake, the rifle up, his heart pounding. Scanning the darkness for the threat, the scream came again, shorter this time, ending in a choked, desperate gasp. It came from the cot. He saw her, a pale shape in the dark, thrashing, fighting the blankets. She was still asleep, trapped in a place far worse than this cabin. "No!" she shrieked. "No, please, not the water! It's too cold! It's too cold! Get him off!" Cain lowered the rifle. His first instinct was to go to her, to shake her awake, to stop the noise. But he remembered the way she had flinched from his touch. He remembered the raw fear. So he did not touch her. Instead, he walked to the table, struck a match, and lit the oil lamp. The small, yellow light pushed back the shadows. He took a log and dropped it onto the embers. The fire sparked, and small flames began to lick at the wood. Then he went back to his chair. He sat down, not with his rifle, but just sat. He rested his forearms on his knees and waited. The sound from the cot had changed. The screaming had stopped, replaced by a desperate, hitched sobbing. She was awake. "You're here," he said, his voice a low rumble. He did not look at her. He looked at the fire. "In the cabin. You're safe. It was a dream." He heard her trying to catch her breath. The cabin was filled with the sound of her quiet, desperate weeping, and the crackle of the new flames. He sat for a long time, saying nothing more, just letting his presence be a solid, unmoving thing in the lamplight. After maybe 10 minutes, the crying softened, then stopped. There was only the wind and the fire. It was my uncle," she whispered. Her voice was a cracked, unused thing. Cain did not move. He kept his eyes on the fire. He just listened. "My ma, my PA, they died. The fever, last winter." Her voice was flat, reciting a story she had told herself 1,000 times. "We had a farm in Illinois." She paused, took a shaky breath. "Uncle Silas, my pa's brother, he came to take the farm. He said he wouldn't feed a useless mouth. He said I had to earn my keep." Cain's hands tightened on his knees. He knew a Silas? The world was full of them. He sold my contract to a man, a farmer, he said, near Denver." She was speaking to the wall, to the darkness, not to him. "But he wasn't a farmer. He ran a place for men." The silence stretched. Cain could feel the shame and the cold of the memory radiating from the cot. "I ran," she whispered. "I ran for 2 days. I fell in the creek. It was so cold. I think that's when I hurt my hip on a rock. I kept going. A man found me, an old trapper. He stitched me up. But he took my locket, my ma's locket. For the trouble." She swallowed. "He said he was taking me to a doctor, but he took me to that place, the trading post. He sold me to that auction man." She stopped. The story was told. The cabin was heavy with the ugly, simple truth of it. Cain finally turned his head. In the dim light, he could just see her face, pale and streaked with tears. "My name," she said, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. "My name is Eliza." It was the first piece of herself she had offered. A name, an identity. Josiah Cain nodded, a single, short dip of his chin. "Eliza," he said. He acknowledged the name, and the pain that came with it. He looked back at the fire. "You should sleep. Nothing's coming in here tonight." "Why?" she asked, her voice a little stronger. "Why did you take me?" Cain stared at the flames. He thought of the men in the yard, of their laughter. He thought of the 2 lawmen, of the blood on the snow by the Arkansas River. He thought of his sister, Sarah, and what had been done to her. "I'm not a good man, Eliza," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Don't go mistaking me for one. I've done things." He grunted, shifting in his chair. "But I don't hold with men like that. I don't hold with auctions, and I won't let you die." It was not a promise of kindness. It was a statement of fact, as hard as the granite peaks outside. He heard her settle back into the blankets. The lamp burned for another hour before he blew it out. And in that hour, for the first time, the cabin was quiet. After that night, the air changed. She was still Eliza, and he was still Cain, but the silence between them was different. It was shared. She began to work, truly work. She took over the cooking, such as it was. She made the rabbit stew, and she was careful with the flour, making the cakes even thinner, stretching the supply. She was a woman who knew farm work. She knew how to make do. One afternoon, she watched him trying to mend a tear in his spare shirt. He was using a thick, clumsy bone needle and a piece of sinew. His large fingers fumbled with the small task. She got up. "Please," she said. He stopped, confused. "Please," she said again, and held out her hand for the shirt. He looked at his own clumsy stitches, then at her small, thin hands. He handed her the shirt. She went to his mending kit and, after a moment of searching, found a smaller, finer steel needle he'd forgotten he owned. She found a spool of real thread, not sinew. She sat on the cot and began to stitch. He watched her. Her work was not like his. Her stitches were tiny, straight, and perfect. She moved with a speed and confidence that was absent in her other movements. This, she knew. This was her skill. She was not just mending the tear, she was reinforcing the whole seam. Her head bowed, her pale hair falling forward. He felt a strange, tight feeling in his chest. It was an echo of a feeling he hadn't had in years. He grunted and turned away, angry at the softness. He went outside to chop wood in the falling snow, swinging the axe with a violence that was meant for more than just the wood. When he came back in, she had folded the shirt and set it on the table. The seam was stronger than new. He picked it up, ran his thumb over the fine stitches. He said nothing, but he put it on the next day, and it was warmer. The storm broke on the 20th day. The sun came out, a pale, weak disk in a bright blue sky. The light that flooded the cabin was blinding, reflecting off the mountains of new snow. It was too much for Eliza. After weeks in the twilight, the brightness, the sudden silence of the wind, it made her frantic. She had to get out. Cain was checking his roof, clearing the heavy snow load. He told her to stay, but she bundled herself in his coat, put on the moccasins, and slipped out the door. She was drawn to the creek. It was mostly frozen, a ribbon of black, moving water visible under shelves of ice. She stood at its edge, staring into the water, and he found her there an hour later. She was standing still as a statue, the oversized coat hanging off her. She was shivering, but not from the cold. She was muttering to herself, her voice a low, desperate litany. "Not his," she was saying, her eyes fixed on the dark water. "Not his. I won't be. Never again. I am not. I am not anyone's property. Not again." She was seeing the auction yard. She was seeing the man her uncle had sold her to. She was seeing the creek she had fallen in. She was reliving it. Cain's heart gave a single, hard thump. He saw the trauma, the way it held her, the way it was trying to pull her down into the ice. He walked up behind her. She did not hear him. He was carrying a thick wool blanket from his bedroll. He did not speak. He did not touch her with his hands. He opened the blanket to its full width and wrapped it around her from behind, pulling her back against him. He drew her into the shelter of his own body, enclosing her completely. He was a wall of heat and solid muscle, and he put his own oilcloth coat around them both, shielding her from the wind. He just held her. At first, she went rigid, a new terror replacing the old, but he did not grope. He did not demand. He just held. His chin rested on the top of her head. He was breathing slow and steady. "You're on the mountain," he said, his voice a low vibration against her back. "You're with me. You are no one's property. You are just Eliza." And with those words, the fight in her broke. The terror, the hunger, the cold, the weeks of silence and fear, it all gave way. She did not scream. She did not sob. She just cried, a silent, desperate, exhausted, weeping. Her shoulders shook, and she clutched the blanket at her chest. She cried quietly into the rough hides that covered his chest. Josiah Cain stood there, unmoving. holding her weight as she wept. He looked out over the frozen, sun-scorched wilderness, a hard, protective anger in his eyes. He let her cry until she was empty, until she was just a shivering weight in his arms. When she was done, he did not release her. He just kept holding her, sharing his warmth, until the shivering stopped. The line crossed that day was one from which there was no return. The cabin, once a cage, now felt different. It was still small, but it was charged. The tension was so thick he could taste it, like iron. Eliza changed. The fear in her eyes was still there, but it was buried deep. When she looked at him now, it was with a soft, searching curiosity. She watched his hands, not for their violence, but for their sureness. She watched his face when he sat by the fire, seeing the lines of old pain around his eyes. She began to see the man, not just the mountain, and he felt her watching. It made him restless. It made him angry. He was a man who had built a wall around himself, and this small, quiet woman was dismantling it, one look at a time. He avoided her gaze. He became gruff again, his voice short, his orders blunt. He spent more time outside, hunting for game that was not there, checking traps that were empty. But he would come back. He would come back to the cabin, and she would be there, a quiet presence by the fire, stitching his old clothes, the smell of wood smoke and rabbit stew in the air. The air grew heavy with unspoken things. It was in the way she handed him his mug, their fingers brushing. It was in the way he would wake in his chair to find she had put another blanket over him in the night. It was in the sudden, sharp awareness of their breathing in the dark. It was want, but it was tangled with fear. His fear of letting anyone in, her fear of any man at all. And yet, the want remained. It was a want for warmth, for a shared glance, for the simple, profound comfort of not being entirely alone in the vast, cold, hungry wilderness. The tension simmered, a pot set to boil, and neither of them knew how to stop it. The deep winter settled in, a cold so profound it felt permanent. The snow piled higher than the window, and the world became a blue-lit cave, governed by the rhythms of the fire. Their lives shrank to a simple, shared routine. He would rise in the dark, his movements quiet, and build up the fire. She would already be awake. Listening, he would haul in snow to melt for water. She would make the thin pine needle tea, a bitter substitute for the coffee he missed. But it was hot, and it was something they shared. They spoke, but not often. Their intimacy was woven in gestures. It was the way she handed him the hot mug of tea, her fingers careful not to touch his, but brushing all the same. It was the way he would leave the best piece of the rabbit stew on her tin plate. It was in the quiet hours of the evening, when he would sit cleaning his rifle for the 10th time, and she would sit on the hearthstone, mending his socks with thread pulled from an old blanket. They were two people in a small, silent boat, adrift in a white, frozen ocean. The cold was the true enemy. It was a living thing that seeped through the chinking and breathed down the chimney. The cot, pushed against the far wall, was the coldest part of the room. Cain watched Eliza as she slept, or tried to, buried under every blanket they had, her body still tight and shivering. One night, the temperature dropped so far the logs of the cabin groaned in protest. He was in his chair, half dozing, the fire burning hot. He heard her teeth chattering, a small, desperate sound in the silence. He stood, his patience with the cold broken. "You'll freeze on that wall," he grumbled. He grabbed the cot and, with a grunt of effort, dragged it across the floor, placing it much closer to the fire, not 3 feet from his own chair. She watched him, her eyes wide, but said nothing. It was warmer, but it was not enough. The next night was just as bitter. He found himself restless, unable to sleep, his anger at the cold a physical ache. He could hear her restless turning, the dry whisper of the blankets. He surrendered. He let out a long breath, and the sound was a white plume in the cabin air. "Get your blankets," he said into the darkness. She went still. "What?" "Get your blankets. Lie on the hearth. It's the only place with any heat." She hesitated. The hearthstone was his. It was the floor at the foot of his chair. "Now," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. Slowly, she gathered her pile of blankets and his old shirt. She padded over and made a small nest on the flat stones. So close he could have reached out and touched her head. He sat in his chair, rifle beside him, and stared into the fire. It was a truce with the cold, but it was a declaration of war on the last of their boundaries. He must have slept. He woke hours later, the fire low, the cabin dangerously cold. He was stiff, but a deeper instinct had woken him. He looked down. Eliza was curled on the stones, shivering in her sleep. In the dim, red light of the embers, he saw her face, unguarded and young. She looked like a child, not the haunted woman from the auction. A deep, protective instinct, one he had buried for years, twisted in his gut. He rose slowly. He took his heaviest wolf pelt coat from its peg and draped it over her, adding it to her pile. He sat down again, closer, his back against the side of the fireplace, blocking the draft. He was on the floor with her now, awake, guarding her sleep. He watched the embers, and he must have dozed again, his head nodding against the stone. He felt it before he was fully awake. A touch. It was light as a moth's wing, hesitant, and it sent a shock through his entire body. He kept his eyes closed, his breathing even. The touch came again, a single, small finger, tracing the line of a white scar on his collarbone, just visible above the collar of his flannel shirt. She was exploring him, as if he were a map. He could feel the warmth of her breath, millimeters from his skin. She was so close. He inhaled sharply, and his eyes snapped open. She froze. Her hand was caught, hovering just above his chest. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the firelight, met his. She looked like a deer about to bolt. His first instinct was to pull away, to snarl, to put the wall back up. He grabbed her wrist, his hand swallowing hers. His grip was iron. "Don't!" he rasped, his voice thick with sleep and something else. But she did not pull away. She did not flinch. She just stayed there, her pulse leaping under his fingers. She looked at his hand holding hers, and then back to his face. His breath was coming harder now. He could smell the soap scent of her skin, the faint, clean smell of her hair. He was fighting a battle he had not known he was in, and he was losing. He let go of her hand, shoving it away gently. He turned his head, staring into the dying fire. He could not look at her. "Eliza," he whispered, the name a strange, rough sound in his mouth. "You deserve more than this. You deserve more than what I am, a good man, a real home, not a fugitive in a hole in the ground." The silence stretched. He expected her to retreat, to go back to her blankets, to let the wall stand. Instead, she moved. He felt her shift, the rustle of the blankets. She moved onto her knees, beside him on the hearth. He kept his face turned away, his jaw rigid. "Cain," she whispered. He had never heard her say his name. He tensed. She leaned in. He thought she might speak again. Instead, he felt a soft, impossible warmth against the side of his neck, just below the rough line of his beard. She was kissing him. It was not a demand. It was a tender, simple, devastatingly bold touch. His entire body went rigid as stone. No one had touched him with kindness in 8 years. He stopped breathing. She did not pull away. She rested her lips there for a long moment, and then she whispered, her breath hot against his skin. I decide what I want." He did not move. He could not. He was frozen, balanced on the edge of a precipice. He felt her small hand come to rest on his shoulder. He turned his head. He looked at her. Her face was inches from his. In her eyes, he did not see the terror he was used to. He saw a woman, scared, yes, but also clear-eyed and certain. A lifetime of violence, of solitude, of hard, cold emptiness, warred with the warmth of her hand. He did not say a word. He reached out, his calloused, scarred hand impossibly gentle, and cupped the back of her head. He drew her to him. He pressed his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. He pulled her down onto his own pallet of furs, sweeping his arm around her, pulling her against the length of his body. He wrapped the heavy blankets around them both, enclosing them in a shared cocoon of warmth and shadow. He held her, just held her. His arms were tight around her, her face pressed into the rough flannel of his shirt. He could feel her heart beating, a frantic, bird-like rhythm against his own steady, heavy thump. The air was electric. This was not the simple holding at the creek. This was fire. He could feel the small, wiry strength of her, the softness of her hair under his chin. He wanted, with a violence that shook him, to consume her, to claim her, to wipe the memory of every other man from her mind. And he was terrified. He held himself in check, his body knotted with restraint. He was a brute, a killer. He had no right to this. She must have felt the war in him. She did not struggle. She did not push. She just settled. She wrapped one small arm around his waist, her fingers clutching his shirt, and held on, as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. They lay like that for the rest of the night, tangled together. They did not sleep. They just breathed and listened to the fire crackle and felt the slow, burning, silent burn of need held at bay by the thinnest wall of fear. Dawn came like a judgment. The blue light filtering through the snow-packed window was cold and sharp, and it broke the spell. They pulled apart, the movement stiff and awkward. Kane stood up too quickly. He could not look at her. The intimacy of the dark felt like a shame in the light. I'll check the traps, he muttered. He grabbed his axe. He did not go to the traps. He burst from the cabin and went to the wood pile. He began to chop wood. A furious, desperate rhythm. The axe rose and fell. Thwack, thud, thwack, thud, the sound echoing flatly in the frozen air. He was trying to chop the memory away, to sweat out the want, to punish himself for the softness. Inside, Eliza sat up. She was trembling. She had been held. She had been warm. She had been safe, and she had wanted him. The realization terrified her. What was she becoming? She put her face in her hands, her body shaking with a confusion that was more painful than the cold. She scrambled up, grabbed his coat, and ran from the cabin. She did not go near him. She ran to the creek, to the one place that felt familiar in her despair. She knelt by the black, icy water and wept, the tears freezing on her cheeks. She cried for her lost life, for the fear she could not escape, and for the terrifying, impossible hope that had just touched her in the dark. Kane stopped chopping, his chest heaving, the axe biting into the block. He stopped, not because he was tired, but because he heard it, a sound that did not belong. It was not the wind. It was not a wolf. It was the creak of saddle leather, the muffled plod of a horse in deep snow. His blood went cold. He dropped the axe and was inside the cabin in 3 long strides, his movements sudden and lethal. Eliza had just returned, her face pale and streaked with tears. She gasped as he burst in. "Someone's coming," he said. His voice was flat. The man from the night before was gone. This was the fugitive. This was the killer. He grabbed his heavy Sharps rifle from the wall pegs and broke it open, checking the load. "Where?" she whispered, her eyes wide with a new terror. "Root cellar." He nodded at the heavy wood hatch under the cot. "Get in, now." He moved the cot aside. "Kane, do not," he snarled. "Make a sound. Do not come out. I don't care what you hear. You understand me." She saw the man who had shot 2 lawmen. She nodded, her face white. She lifted the heavy door, slipped into the cold, earthy darkness, and pulled it shut. He shoved the cot back over it, threw a blanket across it, and turned to the cabin door, his rifle held loosely at his side. He stepped onto the small porch, squinting against the bright snow. A man on a tired bay horse was picking his way into the clearing. He was not a mountain man. He wore a greasy brown duster and a dark bowler hat. His face was pocked and his eyes were small and shifty. "Howdy," the man called, his voice trying for friendly. He stopped his horse a safe distance away. "Cold one." Kane said nothing. He just stood there, a mountain of hides and beard, the rifle looking like a toy in his hands. Name's Barlow, the man said, forcing a smile that did not touch his eyes. Just checking my lines. Heard tell someone was holed up in this gulch. You heard right. Kane's voice rumbled. I don't welcome visitors. Not looking for trouble. Friend. Barlow raised his hands, showing them empty. Just information. A man alone up here. He sees things. Barlow reached slowly into his duster. Kane's thumb moved to the hammer of his rifle. The man pulled out a folded, damp piece of paper. He shook it open. It was a bounty poster. Been looking for this one, Barlow said, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. A runaway. A little thing. Pale hair, gray eyes. Under the floor. Eliza had her ear pressed to a crack in the boards. She could hear the muffled voices. Stole a heap of property from a very important man. Barlow went on. A judge. Judge Marcus Thorne, down in Elbert County. Jewelry, cash. A wicked, thieving girl. Kane's face was unreadable. There's a reward. Barlow leaned forward in his saddle. $50. Gold. Just for word of her. Seems she ran this way. Thought you might have seen her. He held the poster out. Kane did not take it. From where he stood, he could see the crude charcoal sketch. It was her. The artist had caught the haunted, hollow look of her eyes. Kane looked at the poster, then at Barlow. Haven't seen anyone? He said. Not since the first snow. Barlow's shifty eyes narrowed. He looked past Kane, at the cabin. He sniffed the air, smelling the wood smoke. You sure? She's a frail thing. Wouldn't last a day out here. Not unless someone took her in, gave her shelter. I told you, Kane said, his voice dropping, the sound of gravel grinding. I haven't seen her, and this is my land. You should move on. Another storm's blowing in by dark. The threat hung in the frozen air. Barlow's false smile wavered. He was looking at Kane's rifle, and at the man holding it. All right, friend. All right. No harm in asking. He folded the poster and tucked it away. $50 is a lot of coin. If you do see her, I'll be at Croft's trading post for 2 days. Ask for Barlow. He tugged his horse's head around. A pleasure, friend. He kicked the tired animal into a walk, disappearing back into the pines. Kane did not move. He stood on the porch for 5 long minutes, his rifle ready, listening, until the only sound was the wind in the trees. He went inside. The cabin felt cold. He moved the cot, lifted the hatch. He's gone. Eliza climbed out, her body shaking so hard she could barely stand. I heard, she whispered. He said... I know what he said. Kane said, his voice hard. He was already moving, checking the door, barring it. $50? She breathed, her hand to her mouth. They're hunting me. He's just one man. He'll bring others, she said, her voice rising in panic. For that much money, he'll... It's nothing, Kane snapped, his own fear and anger making him cruel. He was trapped. This visitor had brought the whole rotten world crashing into his refuge. Eliza flinched, as if he had struck her. She looked at him, at his hard face, at the rifle he was still holding. She saw him calculating. She saw the fugitive. She had brought this to him, this man who had saved her, who had held her. They would find her, and when they did, they would find him. They would see the man who had shot 2 lawmen. She could not be the one who put the rope around his neck. She said nothing else. She retreated to the cot, her silence absolute. Night fell. They ate their stew in a thick, suffocating silence. The awkwardness of the morning was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp dread. Kane eventually sat in his chair, rifle across his knees. He closed his eyes. Eliza watched him, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She waited. 1 hour, 2, his breathing deepened, became slow and even. She moved, quiet as a shadow. She had nothing to pack. She took the small piece of dried venison he had given her at supper and the last hard biscuit. She put on the moccasins. She looked at the wolf pelt coat he had covered her with, but she left it. She took only one of the wool blankets. She slid to the door, her hand reaching for the wooden latch. "And where are you going?" His voice cut the darkness, and she froze, her heart leaping into her throat. He was on his feet, a dark, massive shape by the fire. He had not been asleep. I have to go," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't stay. That man, he'll come back. He'll bring others. They'll find me." "And you'll what?" He stalked toward her, his fury a tangible thing. "You'll go back to the creek? You'll freeze in the snow before you're a mile down the gulch? Is that what you want?" "It's my trouble," she cried, turning to face him, tears of desperation streaming down her face. "It's not yours. You saved me. I won't be the reason they hang you." "You think I care about that?" he roared, grabbing her by the shoulders. His grip was bruising. "You think I'm afraid of a two-bit bounty man and a corrupt judge? You should be. $50. He'll tell everyone." "I've handled others," he growled, and the darkness in his voice, the memory of the two dead lawmen, hung between them. "I stole nothing," she suddenly shrieked, the accusation on the poster breaking her. "He lied! I didn't steal. I won't be called a thief." "I know," he said, his voice suddenly softer. "You don't!" she sobbed, beating at his chest with her small fists. "You don't! You think I'm some whore from that auction. You—" "Stop it," he said, catching her wrists. "Just stop. I don't care what you did. I don't care if you stole the whole damn county." "But I didn't." Her need to be believed, to be seen as more than what they called her, was overwhelming. The judge, Marcus Thorne, my uncle, he sold my contract to him." Kane's blood went cold. "The judge. He didn't want a maid," she whispered, her body shaking violently, the memory pouring out of her. He said his wife died. He said he wanted a new one. He had papers. He said I was his property. He tried to force me." Her eyes were wide, seeing that room, not the cabin. I hit him with the poker from the fire. I ran. I fell from his window. That's when I hurt my hip. I didn't steal anything. Kane, I just ran." She was sobbing, her face buried in her hands. "He doesn't want the money. He just wants me. He wants to punish me for running." Kane stared at her. The whole ugly, rotten story clicked into place. The auction, the lie, the bounty, the man who thought he could own her, all the restraint in him, all the walls, all the anger at the world and the fear for her. It shattered. He pulled her hands from her face. "Eliza." She looked at him, her face a mask of tears and terror. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not gentle. It was not the tender kiss from the night before. It was a kiss of pure, primal fury. It was raw and desperate and possessive. It was a brand. It was a growl that said mine. It was his answer to the judge, to Barlow, to the men at the auction. It was a vow to the world that this one was not for sale. She was shocked stiff for a second, and then, with a small, broken sound, she kissed him back. She clutched the front of his shirt, her fingers digging in, her own desperation matching his. He broke the kiss, but did not move. He pressed his forehead to hers, and they were both breathing like they had run for miles. "They," he said, his voice a low, shaking promise, "will not take you." He bent, slid one arm under her knees, the other around her back, and lifted her. He carried her away from the door, back to the hearth. He laid her on the pallet of furs and blankets. The awkwardness of the morning, the fear, it had all been burned away by the truth. He did not go back to his chair. He lay down beside her, pulling her against him, covering them both with the heavy wolf pelt. He kissed her again, and this time, the fury was gone, replaced by a desperate, aching need. It was a question, a promise, and a plea. She answered him. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down, her body molding to his. That night, as the wind howled and the threat of the world gathered outside their small, weak door, they did not just share warmth, they staked a claim. It was raw and emotional and desperate. It was the joining of two fugitive souls, a final, defiant act of belonging in a world that had tried to tear them apart. And in the darkness, for the first time, neither of them was alone. The storm cleared as if a knife had cut the sky. The wind dropped, and a silence, vast and heavy, fell over the snow-covered peaks. In the cabin, the new quiet was as loud as the gale had been. Kane and Eliza moved in the bright morning light, the awkwardness of the previous day replaced by a deep, unspoken gravity. They had crossed a line, and the world had shifted. He was no longer just her rescuer, and she was no longer just his burden. They were something else. He stood by the door, looking out at the clearing. The snow was a pristine, glittering sheet, but he saw only the tracks Barlow had left, a faint depression already being erased by the wind. "He'll be back," Kane said, his voice a low rumble. He did not look at her. "He'll go to the post. He'll talk." "That $50 will sound like 1,000 to some men. They'll come." Eliza was by the fire, her hands clasped together. She was dressed in her own mended clothes, which he had washed and dried. They hung on her, but she wore them with a new stillness. "What will we do?" He turned to face her. His eyes were dark, his face set in hard lines. "I will protect you," he said. It was not a boast. It was a simple statement of fact, as plain as the rifle in his hand. "But they will not stop. A man like that, a judge, he will not let this go." He paused, his gaze intense. "So I'm going to teach you. I'm not always going to be there. You're not going to be that girl in the mud ever again." The training began that day. He took her outside into the blinding, cold brightness. First, he taught her the horse. He had only the one, the mean-eyed roan. "He's not a gentle ride. He's a tool. He'll test you. Don't let him." He taught her how to saddle the gelding, how to tighten the cinch, how to read its ears, how to mount not from a block, but from the ground, grabbing the mane and swinging up. She was clumsy, and her body was still weak. The horse sidestepped, snorting, trying to intimidate her. "Show him who's master." Kane growled. "He smells your fear." Eliza, her face set with determination, grabbed the reins, her voice a sharp command that surprised them both. "Stand!" The horse, shocked by the tone, stilled. She swung herself up, landing hard in the saddle. "Good!" Kane grunted, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Now ride, not like a lady in a park. Ride like you're running for your life." He slapped the horse's rump, and it bolted. Eliza cried out, clutching the horn, but she stayed on. She rode, her small figure struggling for balance, across the clearing and into the shallower snow by the trees, and she brought the horse back, panting, but upright. "Again," he said, "ee." They did this for hours, until her legs were shaking and her hands were raw. Then he taught her to shoot. He did not give her the heavy sharps. He gave her his own repeating rifle, a Winchester 73. "It's lighter. It holds more shots. You just point and pull." But it was not that simple. The rifle was still heavy for her, the kick of it a brutal force. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel. "Squeeze," he said, his voice close to her ear. He stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "Don't pull, squeeze, and don't close your eyes." Her first shot was a deafening blast that echoed off the mountains. The recoil slammed her back against his chest, and the bullet went wild, kicking up a puff of snow 10 feet wide of the pine knot he had pointed to. She was terrified of the noise, the violence of it. "Again," he said, his voice calm, his hand still on her shoulder. "You're afraid of it? Don't be. It's just iron and wood. You control it." She fired again, and again. She shot until her shoulder was a purple, swelling bruise. She shot until her ears rang. She shot until the smell of gunpowder was in her hair and on her skin, and she began to hit the knot. "Good," he said, his voice low. Again. In the days that followed, a new rhythm was established. They were no longer just surviving. They were preparing They hunted together. He would take the lead, his long strides silent in the snow, and she would follow, carrying the Winchester, her eyes scanning the trees, learning to see the flicker of a rabbit's ear, the black eye of a grouse. He taught her to track, to read the story in the snow. He taught her how to set a snare, how to gut and skin their catch with a few clean strokes of the knife. She did not flinch. She learned, her movements becoming more confident, her body stronger. The hollow-eyed girl was disappearing, replaced by a lean, hard, watchful woman. She was a woman of the high mountains now. They became a pair. They moved as one, a team. They were closer than any married couple, bound by a shared purpose and a shared, unspoken dread. One night, they sat by the fire, the cabin silent, the stew simmering. They had fallen into a comfortable quiet, the kind that only comes when words are no longer needed to fill the space. They shared a bed now, every night. It was not the desperate passion of that first night. It was something deeper. It was the comfort of a warm body next to hers, the solid, steady breathing of the man who had become her entire world. She was mending one of his shirts, her stitches small and neat. He was cleaning the rifles, the metallic snick-snick of the oiled rag the only sound. "Kane," she said, her voice soft, not breaking the quiet, but adding to it. He grunted, not looking up. "You told me. You said you weren't a good man, that you had done things." She paused, her needle hovering over the cloth. "You know my story, all of it." He stopped cleaning. He set the rifle down, his big hands resting on his knees. He knew this was coming. He had been waiting for it. "I think," she said, her voice hesitant, "I think I have a right to know yours." He stared into the fire. The flames lit the deep. Old scars on his face, the lines of a life lived hard. He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. "I had a sister," he said. His voice was flat, dead, a sound from a tomb. "Sarah, she was young, just 19. Eliza put her mending down. She watched his profile, the rigid line of his jaw. "We had a farm, back in Missouri. The war was over, but it wasn't over. There were men who had learned to like the killing. They rode in bands. They were not soldiers. They were just animals." He picked up a piece of kindling, his hand crushing it, the wood snapping with a sound like a small bone. "They came to our farm. My PA was gone. It was just me and Sarah. I was in the field. I heard her scream." He stopped. His breathing was shallow. He was not in the cabin. He was in that field. 8 years ago. I ran. I had a pitchfork. I was too late. He closed his eyes. There were 3 of them. What they did to her, he could not say it. He just shook his head, a single, violent motion. She was not Sarah. After, she never spoke again. She just sat by the window. She died 6 months later, wasted away. The doctor said it was a sickness of the lungs. I knew. She died of the shame." Eliza's hand went to her mouth, her eyes flooding with tears. "I knew who they were," Kane continued, his voice a low, lethal growl. "They were from the next county. They laughed about it in the saloon. I went to the law. The marshal, he just spat. He said, 'That's war, son. People get hurt.' He said there was no proof, no justice." He opened his hand. The kindling was crushed to splinters. "So I delivered it. I waited 1 week. I got my pa's old hunting rifle. I found the first one on the road to Sedalia. I shot him from 300 yards. The second one, he was in a saloon. I walked in. I shot him in the chest. The third one, he was the leader. He knew I was coming. He tried to hide. I found him. I did not use the rifle." The silence in the cabin was terrible. "They sent a marshal after me," Kane said, his voice devoid of emotion. "And his deputy. They cornered me by the Arkansas River. They called me a murderer. They said to hang. I did not want to, but they drew first. He looked at his hands, as if seeing the blood that would never wash off. I killed them too, and I came up here. I came up here where there is no law, where there are no people. I am what they said, a fugitive, a killer of lawmen. That is who I am. Eliza. He had finished. He had laid his soul bare, and he waited for the judgment. He waited for the fear, for the disgust. Eliza was quiet for a long time. She looked at his hands, those large, scarred, violent hands that had killed 5 men, the same hands that had lifted her from the mud, the same hands that had cleansed her wound, and taught her to shoot, and held her in the night. She slid from the hearth and knelt on the floor in front of him. She took one of his massive, splintered hands in both of her small ones. He flinched, trying to pull away, but she held on. She looked up at his face, her gray eyes clear and steady, the tears still wet on her cheeks. You are not a murderer, Josiah Kane, she whispered, the first time she had ever used his given name. You did what a brother should do. His breath hitched. He stared at her, a profound, aching shock in his eyes. He had expected condemnation. He had received absolution. He bent his head, his shoulders shaking, and for the first time in a decade, he let the wall crumble. He did not cry, but a sound, a dry, ragged gasp of old pain, tore from his chest. She held his hand, and she did not let go. They were closer than ever. The last secret was out, the last wall gone. They were bound, not just by circumstance, but by a shared, hard-won understanding of the world's cruelty and the justice one sometimes had to make. They shared the bed, they shared the chores, they shared the burdens. One night, a few days later, he was carving a piece of pine. He did this often, his knife always moving. She thought he was making a tool or a trap part. He worked on it for 3 nights by the fire, his movements small and precise. On the 3rd night, he finished. He rubbed it with oil from the rabbit fat until the wood was smooth and dark. Here, he said, and he held it out to her. It was a comb. It was a simple, beautiful thing, carved from the pine branch. The teeth were straight and fine. The back of it was carved with a simple wildflower, a columbine, the kind that grew in the high meadows in summer. Eliza stared at it. She reached out, her hand trembling, and took it. It was smooth, and still warm from his hand. She had not owned a comb. She had not owned anything beautiful, or anything that was truly hers. Since her mother's locket was taken, she looked at the comb, at this simple, rough-hewn gift from this hard, violent man. She looked at him, and she began to cry. Not the sobs of terror or grief, but quiet, steady tears. It's just a comb, he said, his voice rough, embarrassed by her emotion. It's beautiful, she whispered. She clutched it to her chest. He had seen a wildflower in a piece of wood. He had seen her. He reached out, his thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. Don't, he said, his voice soft. Don't cry. They began to dream. It was a dangerous, foolish thing to do. When the snow melts, she said one night, her head on his chest. We could leave, go north, to the Oregon Territory. No one knows you there. No one knows me. It's hard country, he said, his arm tight around her. We are hard people, she replied. We could get a small piece of the land, build a new cabin, a real one, with a glass window. Maybe, he whispered, allowing himself the small, painful spark of hope. Maybe we could. The dream lasted for almost a week. They lived in a bubble of fragile hope, a future sketched in whispers in the dark. The bubble burst on a cold, gray morning. He was outside, splitting wood, when he saw them. 3 riders, coming up the gulch. They were not wandering, they were moving with purpose. This was not Barlow, alone. These were hunters. He dropped the axe and was inside in a second. They're here, he said. The words were flat. The dream was over. Eliza's face went white. She grabbed the Winchester. How many? 3. He pulled his sharps from the wall and his heavy Colt revolver from its box. They're armed for a fight. What do we do? She asked, her voice shaking, but her hands steady on the rifle. We don't fight them here, he said, his mind racing. Not in this box. They'll burn us out. He looked at her. The old mining trail. Up the ridge, behind the cabin. It's steep. They won't know it. It'll take us over the pass. We can be gone before they even know we're not here. When? Now, he said. At dawn. It's too close to dark now. They'll camp at the mouth of the gulch. Wait for morning light. We'll be gone by then. Grab the food, the blankets. They packed. Their movements were swift, desperate. The little food they had, the ammunition, the blankets, their new life, their hope, packed into 2 saddle rolls. They waited, the cabin dark, the fire dead, so as not to show smoke. The hours crawled by. The silence was absolute. Kane was at the window, a small hole he had scraped in the ice. Watching, he saw the flicker of their campfire, far down the gulch, just as he thought. They were waiting for dawn. We go in 1 hour, he whispered. But the men were impatient. They didn't wait. The cabin door exploded. It burst open, wood splintering, as a heavy boot kicked it from its hinges. In here, a voice roared. A man filled the doorway, a shotgun raised. Kane, who had been moving toward the door, was already firing. His Colt roared, a deafening blast in the small room. The man in the doorway grunted, firing his shotgun into the ceiling as he fell, and then lay still. He's in here, another voice yelled from outside. Gunfire erupted. A bullet tore through the wooden wall, showering splinters. The window, Kane yelled, shoving Eliza toward the back. He grabbed his sharps, knelt by the wall, and fired through the broken doorway at a muzzle flash. He heard a scream. That was 2. Eliza scrambled to the 1 small window at the back of the cabin. She smashed the glass with the butt of her rifle. Go! Go! Kane roared. Run for the trail! I'm behind you! She hesitated, her face a mask of terror. Josiah! Go! She climbed, scrambling through the small opening, and fell into the deep snow outside. She got to her feet and began to run, plunging through the drifts toward the tree line, toward the trail. Kane fired 1 more shot, then turned to follow her. He threw himself toward the window. A third man, who had circled the cabin, was waiting. He stepped from behind a pine tree, his rifle raised. Kane saw him. He tried to bring his own rifle up, but he was too slow, half in, half out of the window. The man's rifle flashed. Kane felt a white-hot, tearing pain in his left shoulder. It felt like a mule kick. He was thrown backward, into the cabin, landing hard on the floor. His sharps clattered away. I got him, the man yelled, triumphant. I got the big one. Eliza heard the shot. She heard the yell. She stopped. She turned. Through the snow, she saw the man, a dark shape, running toward the cabin, his rifle held ready, moving in for the kill. Everything went silent. The fear, the cold, the panic, it all drained away, replaced by a single, cold, clear thought. You control it. She raised the Winchester. She braced it against her shoulder, just as he had taught her. She sighted down the barrel, at the center of the dark, running shape. She did not close her eyes. She squeezed the trigger. The shot was sharp and clean. The man stopped. He stood still for a second, as if confused. He looked down at his chest. Then his rifle fell from his hands. He knelt slowly, and then toppled face first into the snow. He did not move again. Eliza! Kane's voice, raw with pain, came from the cabin. She ran back, scrambling through the window. He was on the floor, trying to get up, his left arm useless, blood pouring from his shoulder, staining the floorboards dark. I'm here, she panted, grabbing him. The horse, he gasped, his face pale. We have to go now, before more come. She pulled him up. He was a dead weight, but she was strong now. She got him to his feet. He staggered, leaning on her. She got him out the door. The horse, spooked by the gunfire, was stamping at its hitching post. She got him to the saddle. He could not pull himself up. She shoved, he groaned, and he managed to fall across the horse's back. She grabbed the saddle rolls, tied them on with fumbling, bloody hands. She grabbed the reins. "Eliza," he whispered, his head hanging down. "My rifle." "We don't have time," she cried. She pulled the horse's head around. She did not mount. She began to run, pulling the horse, with him on its back, into the deep woods, toward the mining trail, as the first gray, merciless light of dawn broke over the peaks. They were injured. They were cold. They were bleeding. But they were alive. And they were together. The mining trail was a goat track, a scar of loose scree and ice that climbed toward the roof of the world. Eliza did not run. She walked, her head down, her hand gripping the rein of the roan, pulling the heavy horse and its bleeding burden. Josiah Kane was a dead weight, slumped over the saddle, groaning with every jolt. The snow was thinner up here, blown away by the constant, high-altitude wind. But the cold was a razor. It cut through her clothes, through his. She could see the dark, wet stain of his blood spreading on the horse's flank. She did not let herself think. Not about the 3 dead men in the snow. Not about the shot she had fired. She just put one moccasined foot in front of the other, her breath tearing at her raw throat. She was driven by a single, primal command. Move! He had told her about this place. An old-ass sayer's shack. From a mining boom 10 years dead. It was just a dot on the ridge. A place to hole up. To see the world before it saw you. It took them 2 hours to cover a mile. The horse stumbled, its iron shoes scraping on the frozen rock. Kane had stopped groaning. He was quiet. Too quiet. "Josiah," she said, her voice a cracked whisper. "Stay with me. We are almost there." He did not answer. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through her exhaustion. She pulled harder, scrambling up the last rise, and there it was. It was not a cabin. It was a hovel, a pile of gray, wind-blasted planks clinging to the side of the mountain. One wall was just rock. The roof was half-caved, but the stone chimney was intact. It was shelter. She half-dragged, half-lowered him from the horse. He was an impossible weight. He fell into the snow, his body limp. She tied the roan's reins to a dead tree, grabbed Kane under his good arm, and pulled him, inch by agonizing inch, through the broken doorway and into the single, dark, frozen room. It was worse inside. It smelled of rat droppings and old snow, but it had 4 walls and a fireplace. She left him by the door and scrambled for a light. Her hands, numb and shaking, found the tinderbox in her pack. She tore splinters from a broken stool and, with a prayer, struck a spark. A small, weak flame caught. She fed it, her hands trembling, adding dry scraps of wood from an old bunk, until a real fire began to crackle in the hearth. Light and heat. She turned to him. He was pale as the snow, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. His left shoulder was a horror. The heavy hide coat and flannel shirt were soaked, shredded. The bullet had gone all the way through. She knew what she had to do. She had watched him. She took his skinning knife. "Josiah," she whispered. "This will hurt. Forgive me." She cut the coat and shirt away from the wound. He did not move. The bullet had torn a ragged, weeping hole in the muscle of his shoulder, front and back. It was bleeding, but it was the cold that was killing him. She ran outside, gathered handfuls of clean snow, and packed them into their one cookpot. She set it on the fire to boil. She found the small tin of carbolic salve and the linen bandages in his saddle roll. She was no longer Eliza, the girl from the farm. She was a field surgeon, her movements quick and certain. She washed the wound, front and back, with the scalding water. He convulsed and let out a long, low moan, but he did not wake. She packed the holes with the stinging salve and then bound his shoulder, his chest, his arm, as tightly as she could, just as he had bound her hip. She stripped his wet, bloody clothes from him and wrapped him in every dry blanket they owned. She dragged him close to the fire, so close the sparks might catch him, and then the fever came. By nightfall, he was burning. He was not in the shack. He was back in Missouri, his voice a low, tortured rasp. "Sarah!" No, don't touch her. I got the rifle. Pa, just hold on, he thrashed, his good arm striking out, his eyes wide and blind. Josiah, Eliza said, her voice firm, her hands on his chest, holding him down. It's me, it's Eliza. You are safe. You are on the mountain. Eliza, he muttered, his eyes focusing on her for a second, a flicker of recognition in the delirium. The judge, he, hush, she whispered, her voice softening. The terror in his eyes was for her. The judge is not here. No one is here. Just us. He sank back, but the fever held him. He shivered, his teeth chattering even as his skin burned. She did not sleep for 2 days. She sat by his side on the filthy floor, her back against the cold stone, the Winchester rifle in her lap. She kept the fire roaring, feeding it the last of the bunk, the stools, the table. She melted snow and forced water between his cracked lips. When he cried out, she was there. She bathed his face with a damp rag. She stroked his tangled, matted hair back from his forehead, her touch light. It's all right, she whispered into the long, dark hours, her voice the only sound besides the wind. You are not alone. She told him stories. Quiet, rambling stories of her mother's garden in Illinois. She told him about the smell of the apple blossoms, about the red-winged blackbirds in the corn. She spoke of peace, of simple things, filling the cold, high-altitude darkness with memories of a life that was not soaked in blood. She was anchoring him to the world. She was refusing to let him go. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. She awoke, slumped against the wall, to the sound of her own name. Liza. It was a croak. She scrambled to his side. His eyes were open. They were clear, and they were looking at her. Joseph, he whispered. You shot him. I did, she said, her voice thick with exhaustion. Good girl. He breathed, and a faint ghost of a smile touched his lips before he fell back into a deep, true sleep. He recovered, but it was a slow, grudging process. He was weak as a kitten. The man who was a force of nature, who could lift her with one arm, could barely sit up. The wound was clean, but his body was spent, and they had no food. Eliza looked at their small store, a handful of flour, some salt. The venison was gone. You need to eat, he said from the blankets, his voice thin. So do you, she said. She stood up. She picked up the Winchester. It felt comfortable in her hands now, an extension of her. She put on his heavy coat, which swallowed her, and stepped out into the blinding, frozen world. Eliza, no, he protested. It's not safe. We're not safe in here. If we starve, she said, her voice gentle, but firm. I know how to set a snare. I know how to be quiet. You taught me. She left him. She was terrified. She was alone, on the top of the world, with a crippled man to care for and a rifle she had only fired in practice and in one blinding moment of terror. She was gone for 3 hours. Kane lay by the fire, his revolver in his good hand, listening to every gust of wind, every scrape of a branch, imagining riders, or a wolf, or just her. Falling. The door opened. She stood there, her face raw from the wind, her hair full of snow, and in her hand, held by the ears, were 2 white-tailed rabbits. She did not smile. She just nodded, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. She came in, barred the door, and set about skinning them, her movements precise, just as he had shown her. Josiah Kane watched her. He watched this woman, who had been a skeletal, broken thing in the mud. He watched her work, her hands sure, her shoulders straight. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. She was magnificent. She made him broth. She fed it to him, holding the tin mug to his lips, and for the second time in his life, he felt a crack in his hard, scarred soul. The first time had been absolution. This was something else. This was dependence. This was trust. You saved me, he whispered, his voice rough. You saved me first. she replied, her gaze steady. We're even, I suppose. No, he said. I don't think we are. She became the hunter. She chopped kindling with his heavy axe, her small frame straining, but succeeding. She reset the snares. She brought back a grouse. She was lean and tough and strong. She was keeping them alive. As his strength returned, they talked. The dream of Oregon came back, no longer a whisper, but a plan. My PA, he had a cousin, Kane said one night, his arm in a sling she had made from a blanket. Went to the Willamette Valley. Said it was green, rained all the time. Nothing like this. I like the rain, she said, smiling. We'll need new names. I'll be John, he said. John Smith, simple. And she paused. I'll be Eliza, just Eliza. I want to keep my name. I'm not hiding who I am. Not anymore. Eliza Smith. He tested the sound. It's a good name. But to get to Oregon, they needed supplies. They needed a stake. Their 2 saddle rolls were not enough. There's an old post, he said, his voice grim. A way station, down on the supply route. It burned 2, maybe 3 years back, but miners, they scavenge. They might have left something. Flour, a trap, anything. It was a risk. It was 4 miles down the mountain, but it was their only chance. They left 2 days later. He was strong enough to sit the horse, his arm bound to his chest. She walked ahead, the Winchester in her hands, leading the roan. They moved like ghosts through the high passes, descending from the rock and ice back into the trees. The station was a collection of charred logs and collapsed roofs, set in a lonely, windswept valley. It was abandoned. Wait here, Eliza said. I'll look. We looked together, he said, sliding stiffly from the saddle. They picked through the wreckage. It was a cold, desolate place. Old tins, rusted and empty. A broken wagon wheel. Eliza moved into what was left of the main room. A stack of old freight, soaked and frozen, was piled in one corner. Among it, a mail sack, rotted from the snow. She kicked it. Something stiff and dry was inside. She tore it open. It was a bundle of old newspapers, meant for a mining camp that was long dead. They were frozen together, but she tore the top one free. It was a copy of the Denver Daily Tribune, dated 6 weeks past. Nothing, she said, her heart sinking. Wait, Kane said. He was looking at the front page. His eyes narrowed. He pointed with his good hand. Eliza, look. She read the headline, her lips moving silently. Political scandal rocks Elbert County. Judge Marcus Thorne, accused of corruption. Her blood went cold. She dropped to her knees in the snow, her eyes scanning the page, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. Allegations of bribery, extortion, and abuse of power. She read aloud, her voice shaking. The accusations were brought forth by his political rivals, but were given weight by the testimony of a former maid. She scanned the column, her finger flying. A former maid, a Miss Mary O'Connell, testified that Judge Thorne was a man of violent temper and unnatural appetites. She further testified that the judge had illegally detained a young woman, an indentured servant named Eliza. Eliza. She choked on the name. Eliza, with the intent to force her into a false marriage. Miss O'Connell stated that the girl escaped, and that the judge, in a fit of rage, filed a false bounty for theft, to hunt her down like an animal. Eliza was not breathing. She read the last lines. Judge Thorne has been suspended from the bench. A warrant has been issued for his arrest, as he has since fled. A bounty of $100 has been placed on his head. On his head. She dropped the paper. She looked at Kane, her eyes wide with a wild, disbelieving light. I'm not a thief, she whispered. It's true. It's all true. I always knew it was true, he said, his voice rough. He knelt beside her in the snow, his good arm pulling her into a fierce, one-armed embrace. She buried her face in his coat, her shoulders shaking. She was free. The lie was broken. The hunt was over. He's the fugitive now. She wept. Not me. No, Kane said, his hand stroking her hair. Not you. Never you. They did not go north. They went down. They rode out of the mountains, not as fugitives in the dark, but as two free people in the bright, cold sunlight. They rode down into the foothills, toward the flat, open plains where the law was. It took them a week. They found him in a small, dusty town called Calhan, a circuit judge, holding court in a saloon, the whiskey bottles pushed to one side. He was a small, weary-looking man named Elias Stone, with spectacles on his nose and a face tired of human misery. Eliza walked in, her head high, the Winchester in her hand. Kane, a massive, protective shadow behind her. She waited her turn, and then she walked to the makeshift bench. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong. "My name is Eliza, and I have testimony to file." She laid the tattered, frozen newspaper on his table. She told her story. All of it, from her uncle, to the judge, to the auction, to the bounty hunter. She left out only the part about the shootout. She said the men had come, and they had fled. The judge listened. He read the paper. He looked at her strong, honest, weather-beaten face. I believe you, miss," he said. He signed a paper, an affidavit, clearing her of the false charges. He made her name clean. Then he looked at Kane. "And you, sir?" the judge asked, his eyes sharp. "You've been quiet. Have you a name?" Kane and Eliza looked at each other. This was the last luck. "My name," he said, his voice a low rumble, "is Josiah Kane." The judge's eyes widened, just slightly. He knew the name. The air in the saloon went still. "Josiah Kane," the judge repeated, leaning back in his chair. "From Missouri. The Marshall killer." "Yes," Kane said. He did not flinch. Judge Stone took off his spectacles. He polished them. He looked at Kane, then at Eliza, then at the newspaper. "War's a terrible thing, Mr. Kane," the judge said, his voice quiet. "It makes monsters of us all. I was at Shiloh. I saw things I'd rather not remember." He put his spectacles back on. "Missouri's, they're looking the other way. On a lot of old warrants. There's been too much war, too many dead. They want peace. They're letting the old grudges die." He picked up his gavel. "They're not looking for you, son. Not anymore. The world's moved on. Maybe it's time you did, too." He struck the gavel. "Case dismissed. Next." Kane stood there, frozen. He was free. The ghosts of the two lawmen, the weight of the past 8 years. It just lifted. He felt light. He looked at Eliza. She was crying, her hands over her mouth. He took her hand. He did not let her go. They walked out of the saloon, out of the dusty town, into the sunlight. They were free, both of them. They did not go to a church. They did not need a preacher or a witness. They rode back toward the mountains, toward the place that was their home. They stopped at a place where a mountain spring bubbled up from the rocks, the water clear and cold, the first green things of an early spring pushing up through the melting snow. They stood by the water, the roan horse grazing nearby. "Eliza," he said, his voice rough. He took her hands. They were calloused, like his. I ain't got a ring. I ain't got anything. Just this." He motioned to the mountains, to himself. "It's all I want," she whispered, her eyes shining. Will you marry me, Eliza?" he asked. Not as property, not as a contract, but as my partner, my wife." "Yes," she said. "Yes, Josiah, I will." He kissed her. It was not the desperate, angry kiss of the cabin, nor the passionate kiss of their first night. It was a kiss of pure, quiet peace. It was a promise. They married themselves, right there, beside the mountain spring. They spoke their own vows, simple and true. "I will be your shield," he said, "and I will be your home." She replied, There were no witnesses but the trees, and the high, soaring hawks, and the mountains that had forged them. It was a quiet ceremony, and it was the most real thing either of them had ever known. Spring came to the high country not as a gentle thaw, but as a violent cracking. The ice on the creek broke with sounds like cannon fire. The snow, which had been a suffocating white blanket, turned to slush, then to mud, then to 1,000 roaring rivulets. The world, which had been silent and frozen, was now loud with the sound of water and life. They rode down from the assayer's shack on a bright, cool morning. The air was thin and sharp, but it no longer held the bite of death. It smelled of damp earth and pine resin. Kane rode the roan, his arm still in the sling, but his back straight. Eliza walked beside him, her head high, the Winchester resting in the crook of her arm as if it had been born there. They were not fleeing. They were returning. When they reached the gulch, the silence was heavy. The 3 bodies were gone. The snow around the cabin was trampled and disturbed. Barlow, or perhaps Croft, had come to collect their dead and their bounty. The cabin door, splintered and broken, hung from one leather hinge. They stopped at the tree line, just looking. It had been a refuge, a prison, a fortress, and a battlefield. It's a ruin, Eliza whispered, her heart sinking. No, Kane said, his voice quiet. He swung down from the horse, his good arm taking the strain. It's just wood. The walls are good. He walked to the broken door and, with one hand, ripped it from the hinge and threw it aside. He stood in the opening, his broad back blocking the light. The inside was a mess. The table was overturned, the cot smashed. The floor was stained dark, a map of the violence that had happened there. Eliza came to stand beside him. This was the place she had been terrified, and the place she had been held. This was the place she had taken a life. We can't, she started, the memory too strong. We can, he said. He walked inside, his boots echoing on the boards. He went to the window she had scrambled through, the one he had been shot in. He looked at the broken glass, then back at her. This is our land, Eliza. We bought it, with blood. He began to clean. He threw the broken furniture out into the yard. He took the smashed cot and began to break it down for firewood. Eliza, shaking off the ghosts, found the broom. She swept the floor, sweeping out the splinters, the dirt, and the memory of the spent shell casings. She scrubbed the dark stains on the floor, her hands raw, until the wood was pale and clean. He spent 2 days building a new door, his one good arm working with a slow, powerful precision. He planed the wood, fitted it, and hung it on new iron hinges he'd salvaged from the wreckage. When it was done, he barred it. The thud of the heavy wooden bar sliding into place was a sound of finality, a sound of safety. This time, the walls were not to keep the world out. They were to keep their life in. The cabin, scrubbed and mended, was no longer a hole in the ground. It was home. Their first journey back to the world was a test. They needed supplies, not just flour and salt, but seeds and goats. Eliza wanted goats, for milk. They rode the roan down the long, muddy track to the trading post. The world was greening, small, brave flowers pushing up through the mud. When they walked into the dusty, familiar room, Silas Croft was there, behind his counter, measuring out beans for a prospector. He looked up. His eyes widened. He had clearly heard the story. He had clearly seen the bodies. He looked at Kane, then at Eliza, then at the Winchester she still carried. He saw the sling on Kane's arm. He put the pieces together. His thin, greasy smile was one of pure, oily respect, born of fear. Mr. Kane, ma'am. He was no longer looking at a fugitive and a piece of merchandise. He was looking at 2 people who had faced down 3 armed men and walked away. Croft, Kane said, his voice a low rumble. We need supplies, seeds, 2 goats, if you have them, and flour, 100 pounds. Yes, sir, Croft said, his voice quick. Right away. Goats are $3 apiece, for you. We'll take them, Eliza said, her voice clear and strong. She laid a gold coin on the counter, one of the few she'd taken from the bounty hunter's pockets. She did not feel a moment of shame. It was payment. They bought tools, a spade, a hoe, 2 new tin plates. They bought needles and thick bolts of canvas and flannel. They loaded the roan, tied the 2 complaining goats to the saddle, and left. They were no longer ghosts. They were settlers. They were the Canes. Life settled into the rhythm of the seasons. The high mountain spring was short, and the work was hard. The soil in the gulch was thin and rocky. But Eliza was a farmer's daughter. She and Cain worked side by side, clearing a patch of land near the creek. He broke the ground with the spade, his shoulder healing, the muscles in his back bunching with the effort. She followed, her hands in the dirt, breaking up the clods, planting the seeds for beans and squash and hardy mountain greens. The garden was an act of rebellion. It was a statement that they would not just survive, they would live. They would put down roots. The goats, which she named Patience and Prudence, became her constant companions, their bleating a cheerful, silly sound in the quiet gulch. Eliza's skill with a needle, once a tool for mending, became a trade. She had made herself a new dress from the flannel, a deep blue, and it was sewn with a precision that Croft's wife, a woman who came to the post for supplies, had noticed with envy. "That's fine work," the woman, Martha, had said, her fingers touching the seam. "It's just something I do." Eliza had replied, Could you make one for my daughter?" Martha asked, her eyes hopeful. "I'll pay, in coin, or chickens." Eliza came home with 3 laying hens and an order for 2 more dresses. She sat on the porch of the cabin, in the warm afternoon sun, stitching, the sound of the needle pulling the thread, the snip of the scissors. It was a sound of peace, of purpose. She was not just mending, she was creating. Josiah found his own peace, his hands, those hands that had held a pitchfork and a rifle and a skinning knife, those hands that had killed, found a new purpose. He had always been a carver, a whittler. Now, he began to build. He went into the high woods and, with his axe, felled 2 tall aspen. He hauled the logs back and, with a patience that was new to him, he began to work. He built them a real table, one that did not wobble, the white wood smooth as satin under her hands. He built 2 chairs, with strong, carved backs. He built a bed frame, solid and wide, to replace the narrow cot. He was building their life, piece by piece, shaping it from the raw material of the mountain. His work was seen. A rancher, passing through, saw the chairs. "Man," he'd said, "I'd pay good money for a set like that. My wife's been complaining about our benches for 10 years. Cain, the man who had shot 2 lawmen, became a furniture maker. He traded his work for things they needed: a milk cow, a bag of coffee, a small cast-iron stove that made the cabin warm and bright. They were no longer defined by what they had run from. They were defined by what they built. One evening, as summer was just beginning to touch the high peaks, they sat on the small porch he had built. The air was cool and smelled of pine. The creek was a silver ribbon in the twilight. He was smoking a pipe, a luxury he now allowed himself, watching the shadows lengthen. Eliza sat beside him, in a small rocking chair he had made for her. She was quiet. She had been quiet all evening, with a thoughtful, soft stillness that he had come to recognize. "Josiah," she said, her voice soft. He turned. "Eliza." She held a small, dark wooden box in her lap. He recognized his own carving on the lid, the same columbine flower he had carved on her comb. He had made the box for her, to keep her needles and thread. I have something," she said. A wedding gift, I suppose." "It's late." He watched, his brow furrowed. As she opened the lid, inside, on a piece of clean flannel, were 2 objects. The first was the bounty poster. It was torn and stained with water and mud, but the crude sketch of her haunted face was still visible. He had not seen it since that day with Barlow. He realized, with a jolt, that she must have taken it from the body of the man she had shot. She had carried it with her, this whole time. The second object was a small, bright lock of her hair, the color of pale corn silk, tied with a piece of blue thread. Josiah stared into the box. It was their whole story. The lie that had branded her, the piece of her that was true. He reached out, his calloused finger touching the rough paper, then the soft, clean hair. He could not speak. He looked at her, his throat thick, his heart an ache in his chest. He was overwhelmed by the sheer, terrible weight of what they had endured, and the simple, profound fact that they were here. She placed her small, work-roughened hand over his. "That," she whispered, her eyes meeting his, her gaze clear and strong, "is who I was, the girl they hunted, the girl they tried to own." She closed the lid, the small click echoing in the quiet evening. "No one owns me, Josiah," she said, her voice steady as the mountain. "But I belong with you." He pulled her to him, his arm wrapping around her, burying his face in her hair. He held her, his body shaking with an emotion he had no name for. It was gratitude. It was awe. It was a love so deep it was part of his bones. He was a man who had been saved, not from death, but from a life that was not worth living. Their passion, which had been born in a desperate, fearful, angry fire, now burned in a different way. The fear was gone. The desperation was gone. In its place was a deep, slow, steady trust. It was in the way she would fall asleep in his arms, her breathing slow and even, with no nightmares. It was in the way he would wake in the night, find her hand, and hold it. It was in the small, shared moments of the day. A glance across the garden, a hand on his shoulder as she passed him. A shared, quiet laugh when one of the goats stole a biscuit from his plate. The desire was still there, a current of heat that ran between them, but it was no longer the only thing. It was just one part of a love that was now as solid and as real as the stone foundations of their home. The summer deepened, and Eliza began to change. She was quiet. In that way she had. But there was a new light in her eyes, a private, joyful secret. She would stop in the middle of her work, her hand resting on her belly, a small, wondrous smile on her face. Cain, who had learned to read her every breath, her every silence, saw it. He knew before she said a word. He found her by the creek one afternoon, kneeling, washing clothes. He came and knelt beside her, his big hand still. "Eliza," he said, his voice rough. She looked up, and in her eyes, he saw the answer. "Yes," she whispered. In the winter, by the new year." He felt two things, sharp and sudden, warring in his chest. The first was a jolt of pure, primal terror. It was the fear of his past, the memory of Sarah, the knowledge of what the world could do to something small and innocent and beloved. He was terrified of that vulnerability, of loving something that could be so easily broken. The second feeling, which rolled over him like a warm wave, was a joy so profound it stole his breath. A child, their child, a new life, born not of violence or fear, but of this peace. It was a future. It was redemption. It was proof that he was not the end of a broken line. His hand, trembling slightly, reached out and touched her still flat belly. A child," he breathed. He was overjoyed, and he was terrified. She saw it all in his face. She covered his hand with hers. "We will protect this one," she said, her voice fierce. "Together." He nodded, a tight, sworn vow. Together. He began to build the cradle that evening. He did not use pine or aspen. He went high up the mountain, to a stand of old, hard oak, and brought back a length of dark, seasoned wood. He worked on it by the fire, in the evenings. This was not furniture. This was a prayer. He would not let her help him with the heavy work, but she sat with him, sanding the pieces he had cut, her small hands making the wood smooth as water. They built it together. He carved the headboard, not with columbines, but with two small, sleeping goats, a sign of the peace and plenty he wished for his child. As he worked, he would sometimes hum, a low, rough sound in his chest. Eliza listened, a small smile on her face. "What is that? I've never heard you hum." He stopped, embarrassed. It's nothing, just A tune. My ma used to sing it. Sing it for me, she said, her head tilted. His voice was a rough baritone, scarred by disuse, but he sang it. It was a simple, old lullaby from the hills of Missouri, a song about a riverboat and a full moon, and a child sleeping safe and sound. He was reclaiming the good parts of his past, the parts before the blood, and offering them to his future. Summer rolled in, and the high country bloomed. The meadows above the gulch, which had been buried under 10 feet of snow, exploded in a riot of color. Red Indian paintbrush, blue columbine, yellow sunflowers. The world was lush and green and alive. One afternoon, late in July, Kane was on the porch, mending a piece of harness, his shoulder now just a dull, silvery scar. The air was warm, smelling of sun on hot pine. He heard a sound, laughter. He looked up. Eliza was in her garden, which was now overflowing. The beans were climbing, the squash were fat and yellow on the vine. She was standing in the middle of it, her hand resting on her belly, which was now a high, proud curve under her blue flannel dress. One of the goats, Patience, was trying to eat a leaf from her hand, and she was laughing, a clear, bright, beautiful sound that echoed in the gulch. Josiah Kane sat, his hands still, and just watched her. He watched his wife, in their garden, laughing in the sunlight, full of his child, her eyes shining with a quiet, simple joy that he had never known existed. He thought of the auction. He thought of the skeletal, broken girl, shoeless in the mud. He thought of the men who had mocked her, and the man who had tried to buy her, and the men who had come to hunt her. He looked at her, radiant in the sun, and a single, profound truth settled in his soul. He whispered it, to himself, to the mountain, not for sale, never was. He turned his gaze from his wife to the high blue peaks, the granite walls that had been his prison and had become his sanctuary. He felt the sun on his face. He heard her laughter. And for the first time in his entire hard, scarred life, Josiah Kane truly, finally believed he was worthy of peace. Thank you so much for listening to our story. It's been a privilege to share the journey of Eliza and Josiah with you. We would be truly honored if you'd let us know where you're listening from. It's always a joy to see how far these tales from the frontier travel. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales of survival, courage, and love. And finally, please share your thoughts on the story in the comments. What part of their journey touched you the most? We read every one, and your words mean the world to us.